they've been briefed not to bring the thing to you.
These are extremely excellent kicks.
Thank you. I got a new pair for the. I got a new pair for the occasion.
Excellent. Like it's my
Yeah, no, my regular pair is a disgrace, and Rue will probably kill me. Really?
washing machine on the road. There you go. I have the exact same.
It is just gone 1:15 now, so yeah, I'm happy to get going.
So good evening, everybody. Let's start. So I'm delighted to have so many of you here from far and wide, I believe, to come to Danny Dresner's inaugural lecture, and I'm immensely pleased and proud to have Danny as Professor Daniel Dresner here in the Department of Computer Science. I'm particularly pleased on the department's behalf, not only as usual for a professorial promotion, but Danny's our first teaching focused professor, which I'm immensely pleased and proud about. But Danny does so much more than just teach within the department. We only have 2 days a week of Danny, but that might actually be news to Danny, I think, because it probably ends up being so much more. So Danny's got a very broad background and a long-standing presence in the perception of risk, the governance of risk, and a lot of standards work nationally. And Danny has a fairly substantial presence in the media every time, or it seems every time that there's a cybersecurity news story, Danny appears as if by magic. So Danny has about an interesting degree, I don't see much more, combined applied physics, computer science and science, combined studies, which is applied broadly in cybersecurity. He's worked at the National Computing Centre. He has his own company, Dresner Associates, and is not only doing his work within the department, but also working at the university level, geeing up our cybersecurity activity, which seems to be paying great dividends. And as well as all his cybersecurity work, Danny is a fund of knowledge about Doctor Who and Blake 7. So when we run out of questions at the end, just asking questions about Doctor Who and Blake 7, and you can wax lyrical, can't you, Danny?
Oh, more than that about cybersecurity. Yeah.
So I give you Danny Dresner, who's going to talk about an attack on a Cyberman.
Thank you, Robert. I'll follow that. Well, firstly, thank you for coming. Good evening. I hope that this evening will give you a feel for some of the areas of cybersecurity that people in hoodies don't often reach. I'll be running a story thread through this, and it tells of when I became the target of an attack. So I'll highlight the indicators of compromise, as we say in the biz, and tell you what I did to cope with the results. You might like to take notes. Tolkien fans might like to draw a map. You might like to play cultural reference bingo and assimilate evidence for a plagiarism case later on. I've tried to include at least if not my references, then at least my influences. This is the story of how I became Professor of Cybersecurity. I pondered over the title because Uli, with good reason, had already introduced me to visitors as Professor of BBC, and that's a badge worn with pride. Let me just say now that as we travel on our journey, just to look out for these signposts, because I'm going to tell the story of when I came under attack. You might say that it was my data because a person is the sum of their data, perhaps a professor of cybersecurity even more so. Teaching is at the core of what I do, so I hope to also paint a picture of some of my tools, techniques and ideas. And that most difficult part, finding time to stop and think. I'm privileged to have worked in and with a diverse selection of government and industry, and all that action research has to rub off somewhere. I'll use these three icons as we go through the evening to remind you, and probably myself, about the focus of the moment. So you'll see that I'm some sort of gestalt, really. I always look forward to weeks when I'm not called into the BBC to speak on TV and radio, because it means that nothing particularly new has happened. I've waxed lyrical about the Zeus Trojan, nice local interest story when a Salford couple were putting malware onto people's PCs to pinch their banking details. I'm not sure whether that was the right fashion choice to talk about the breach of Ashley Madison that day. Show of hands, how many people have got an Ashley Madison account? Liars. Talk, plenty of calls in to talk about mobile phone databases being hacked. Lots of suspicion about the Russians and how it affects our national cybersecurity strategy. And of course, the great worry of people who were putting their details into British Airways sites, not necessarily sitting there and having the database drained, but actually having their credit card credentials drained as they put them in. We are in a university, so I have to be a little bit scientific. This is the first graph of the evening. I don't know whether anybody can actually see the trend. If not, I'll fill it in for you. Because, well, I try to be serious about everything I do, not necessarily how I do it, because cybersecurity is a global problem. It is complex. The threats are legion. The adversaries are amoral and persistent. Nation-state weaponry is available to children and criminals, and the world is too big to model. But perhaps we can find our defense laboratories close to home. Here's a bit of a CV. I'm not sure where to start the story of my journey here. Was it messing about in the streets of Newcastle? The posh part, apparently, which is why even my colleagues at GCHQ have been flummoxed by my accent. A little root cause analysis suggests that the real journey, or the academic part of it, starts about 17 years ago, when Paul Vasidis of NCC Group suggested I join the Computer Science Industrial Liaison Panel. After a couple of years of trying to find security on the syllabus, the late Alex Walker called to say that what with a lot of people on sabbatical and a hole in the syllabus, would I like to fill it with a security module? More importantly, for my management at the National Computing Centre, there was a budget. So I was able to come in for a few weeks each year to teach. I think it took me about 8 years before I turned the right way at the top of the stairs. Now, the story of when I became a target of an attack started with a letter. Well, several letters. Letters from banks, with cards and PIN numbers, allegedly were being delivered and apparently intercepted by criminals. The events, which I denote by the storyteller, remember the icons, will be tracked through the lecture tonight. My application for an account with the Royal Bank of Scotland was declined. I hadn't applied. My TSB credit card was cancelled. I didn't have a TSB credit card. BT kept sending me my customer number because I'd requested it. No, I hadn't. Criminals effectively carried out a denial of service attack on my business telephone banking because I failed the security checks. And BT locked my email account because they detected an attack on it. I was not a happy bunny. I felt exposed and, like Mrs. Mears said, or might have said, all alone in the world. Now, Kipling suggests that the race is won by one and one. Now, looking around the theatre tonight, it ain't necessarily so. Do have fun spotting these references. In the words of the late Douglas Adams, these have helped to shape my hidden shallows. The one I wish to draw your attention to is towards the bottom right. It was back in the school library of Dame Allen's Boys' School, probably about 1974, that I discovered a rebound, yet desiccated and crumbling, copy of a script for the 1950s TV serial Quatermass and the Pit. Professor Bernard Quatermass of the British Experimental Rocket Group was having to reconcile the military expropriation of his facility while assisting his anthropologist friend discern the history of the mysterious capsule and equally enigmatic ape-like creatures. I was showing signs of interest in interdisciplinary collaboration even then. I think what got me hooked was the storytelling of the late Nigel Neal. Now, you won't have heard of Nigel Neal, but I bet most people in this theatre will at some time have read his wife's book, The Tiger Who Came for Tea. What particularly interested me was the evolution of theory from a few pieces of evidence, knitted together with the imagination of the possible. At the time, I thought I'd actually never get to see this, but you've still got a chance because it's actually on iPlayer now. So tonight I would also like to discuss some of my big thinks derived from this sort of stuff, and I'd like to share where the ideas came from. Now Barry Letts and Terence Dix would say, what you need in television is a good, original idea. It needn't, however, be your good, original idea. And that's why Holmes as Moriarty became Doctor Who's master. So here are what I call my good original ideas, but I do give the credits to their sources. Pedagogy, to me, means engineering knowledge so that it becomes wisdom for the recipients. So I have a concept of a DNA-like triple helix to make sure that we teach all the strands that we need to transfer cybersecurity know-how. With a rich variety of viewpoints and interests of what systems should do, I've defined a universal set of cybersecurity objectives with Neera Jones, which we've based on the 3 laws of robotics by Isaac Asimov. And I have an idea for measuring cyber resilience that comes from the astrophysics of black holes. Now, whilst an idea of coping with the challenge of cybersecurity is not one that I think gets enough attention, we sort of have this realization now that cybersecurity wisdom is thick and high in terms of its quantity. The National Cybersecurity Centre have taken to 864 pages to define what we need to know. And how we handle this, for me, comes from an observation from what turned out to be the final Quatermass story, and I'll go into more details of these as we go along. Now, cybersecurity is about creating a safe symbiosis between people and technology. We want stuff that will make life easier, more comfortable, more assured, and perhaps more deterministic. But we've tried to perpetuate those desires in systems that we think will only serve us. And that naivety is perhaps the biggest distraction from cyber. And then we shout about data protection at people as if it's some talisman to protect critical thinking. How often does it put people at risk rather than encouraging a safe solution to an online challenge? The war against criminality is asymmetric by its very nature. We dance around the handbag of regulation whilst bad people ride roughshod over the cyber landscape. We are obsessed with the data, and I worry that we lose sight about protecting people. Now, as I'm here to talk about cybersecurity, I'd want to paint a picture of that landscape. We want to do stuff online to achieve our objectives of paying a bill or dropping a rod into a nuclear reactor. It's quite a variety of stuff. We need it online. It may be data about a thing, or it might be data to control a thing. This online stuff manifests as assets that that have value for us and are also likely to have value for others whom we would like to keep their grubby mitts off. Whether we need to worry is a mix of how important that asset is, how motivated our would-be attackers are, whether they have the capability to act on that motivation, to say, find a vulnerability, something that they can exploit and give them gain and cause us loss. And it's also about how much we care about the outcome. One thing that we can be sure of is that whatever the pain, whatever the loss, whatever the cruel outcomes are on us, the cyber criminals don't give a pair of fetid dingo's kidneys, as Adams might have said, to the impact on us, on our families, or our communities. Cybersecurity is about ways to stop them, slow them down, bring them out into the open, or put them off carrying out their felonious plans in the first place. With a range of techniques we can use, we should pay attention to software quality and build in what the governance people would call controls. So back to my story. It would seem that it tends to follow the Martini principle, anytime, any place, anywhere. And this particular place was a flat in Salford, when I began to find the letters suggesting evidence of some impersonation. Remember, my application for an account for the Royal Bank of Scotland was declined when I hadn't applied, and my credit card had been cancelled with a bank that I didn't have a credit card with. So, what do you do when you see crime being committed? I called the police. They weren't interested. It was not a crime from my perspective because I had not lost any money. The banks were the victim. And anyway, I couldn't prove that credit cards and such were being delivered to my address and taken. But the police call centre operator did suggest that I could get in touch with the Royal Mail and find out what they'd been delivering. I clarified this request. I should ask the Royal Mail for a list of the letters they delivered? Really? This did put me back in mind of the days when I made a call to IT support. This was back in the day, so some of you might not even remember times like this. You had to come to work with your laptop, which was probably more of a loggable, and plug it into what we called the parallel port. I did this, and there was a crack and a spark, and surprise, surprise, my computer wouldn't print. So I called the help desk, and the first question they asked was, what direction was the spark travelling in? This was perhaps a level of critical thinking I wasn't previously aware of. So what about my critical thinking? Navigating problems to find the pockets of knowledge that might solve them is a bit of a thing for me. So I'm going to present Exhibit A. It's often quoted from Tannenbaum's eponymous tome on open systems interconnection that the nice thing about standards is that there are so many to choose from. At the National Computing Centre, despite being frequently told that nobody likes standards, I was equally frequently asked by members to point out which standards of many would help them to solve their particular challenge. The result was desert island standards using the Dix-Letts theorem. So I considered which would be the most useful if you were washed up on a desert island and had to set up an IT department. The theme that I hope is running through this lecture is the coalescence of wisdom from knowledge and particularly its application. I've often said that if you put all the cybersecurity experts into a room with a blank sheet of paper, they'll eventually emerge with the same list that we have already. Whether they break it up into 15 or 19 headings is really immaterial. We seem to have a constant problem with navigating through that knowledge to address the outcomes we desire without resorting to some sort of marketing banter of weakest link or strongest asset when we're talking particularly about people. Now, large organizations may have time to debate, but the SME, the small to medium-sized enterprise, needs to be fleet of foot and adapt complex and apply complex information sets with extremely limited resources under multiple pressures. And this is why Richard Henson from the University in Worcester and I sat down at the overwhelming annual InfoSec exhibition in London in 2009 and came up with IASME. Information Assurance for SMEs. Get it? And with the Technology Strategy Board funding, we designed and trialed an information and cybersecurity framework that would give the small business the same assurance to their supply chain as the corporate brands. It's still the only soup to nuts framework on the planet for SMEs to address cybersecurity. And I hastily add that it took the commercial acumen of Dr. Emma Philpott to turn this academically proven concept of myself, Richard, and the late David Booth into a sustainable business venture. Hey, we became a bunch of security blokes with a boss called M. How cool is that? I'm still taking an active interest in SMEs on two fronts. Here in Manchester, once Cottonopolis and now Cyberopolis, with 4 universities working on the unique cyber foundry programme. So when Phil Swan of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority rallied us to come together for the region, we were adamant that whatever we should do, it should be for the benefit of SMEs. The Foundry is realising the vision that cybersecurity is actually a force for good. Businesses can be innovative online without unduly risking the wrong side of disruption. The Foundry brings SMEs the wherewithal to take ideas forward that would otherwise be constrained by conventional business methods. Meanwhile, IASME is going from strength to strength and is the National Cyber Security Centre's chosen partner for the National Cyber Essentials Scheme, the cyber security 5 a day that we contributed a great deal to when it was being formed from our research. We've also established a security operations centre powered by neurodiversity and guided by social responsibility. Back to the story. Remember the research question that the police had set me? How did I know what was being stolen? So I dutifully called the Royal Mail. No surprise, they didn't keep a list of what was delivered to my address. However, I did pick up the useful intelligence about the mail collect service, where the sorting office holds onto your mail and then you go and pick it up. Worth a try, I thought. There would be nothing more arriving in an unprotected environment for the criminals to pilfer. Life seemed safe for a while. It was probably around this time that the last vestiges of the original National Computing Centre folded. The university was boasting a £2 million recruitment fund. Hello, I said to Jim Miles. Jim explained that the idea was to attract Nobel Prize winners. This is where I played my joker. I suggested that I'd be a good investment because, this is true, 25% of Nobel Prize winners are Jewish, so I had a 1 in 4 chance of winning one. Jim looked at me seriously and explained kindly that it didn't quite work like that. Nevertheless, he did take the risk with 40% of me, and that's rather contributed to me being here today. Oh, that little clip at the top actually was from a real school report from 1978. Well, I wasn't so proud then, but now I can say, well, what the hell. Top of the world, Ma! Oh, it's at this point, going back to school days, that I ought to give a shout out to the late Mr. Walker of Dame Allen's. He was deputy head, all flowing black cape a la Jennings and Derbyshire, and taught geography. Now, someone on Radio 4 described geography as the subject where they put all the other topics together that didn't fit anywhere else. And I mentioned this as an icebreaker when I first met my good friend Joy during our PhD days. She just looked at me and pointed out that geography was her first degree. Whoops. I'm pleased to say that we did go on to do a couple of conference papers together, and we still aspire to bring them together for a journal. One day I asked Mr. Walker why we needed to assimilate so much information about Rotterdam. Because, Dresner, he asserted, one day your boss will drop a pile of files on your desk and ask for a summary on a sheet of A4. God bless Mr. Walker. Welcome to my world. Oh, and God bless Joy for a speedy recovery, please. Standards, a friend once neatly defined, are a distillation of good practice. Despite this opportunity, whilst the criminals attack, we still sit down and have endless committee meetings arguing over which standard is which, and often miss the commonality, which, if mixed with a little faith, is a recipe for achievement if you focus on the goals and the objectives of what a system is actually meant to do. It's a conversation that I often have with students, and they realise that despite the standards, there are still many nuances to systems related to their objectives, be they industrial, medical, military, financial, and so on. Amidst all this influence, I discussed the commonality with Neera Jones, then of Barclaycard, and we defined our universal set of objectives. Whatever the system, it will have core objectives, stuff it must do. Open a valve here, calculate a pension there. If these aren't done, the system fails. So the core of any system is its ability to operate. Around and through this, it's the job of cybersecurity to protect the system and make it resilient in the face of attack. To protect, to operate, and self-preserve. Neera and I call these the 3 laws of information and cybersecurity. Something to stay anchored to amidst the noise and haste. But how do you know if you're likely to be in a state of cybersecurity before the inevitable test pushes you beyond the event horizon and gets me onto the BBC? I believe that there are 5 things that we can measure for the assurance of that. And these are to check, as the school reports might have said, that you are at least doing your best. Number 1, have you divided up your stuff to avoid contagion when bad stuff happens? Have you got the balance of people and technology right in the decision making? Is the training that you're providing for people actually having an impact? Are you keeping an eye on what's going on and the wherewithal to react to what you find? And finally, when bad stuff happens, do you have the coping mechanisms for the people who are affected? So I think that there is good reason to consider that if you know your cybersecurity objectives in terms of the 3 laws and how to measure them in terms of resilience, then you've got the dials. What you need then are the levers to keep us within the boundaries of safety and return to them when we stray or are caused to stray. And this ability to focus actionable knowledge at the point of need is what interests me greatly. I imagine, as Professor Quatermass did in the Quatermass conclusion, a thin skein of energy, or in our case, know-how, that can unravel and focus at the point of need. Much of this knowledge gets codified in standards, British standards, European standards, international standards. And we don't do enough to round-trip their unraveling to that point of need. We don't really test their unraveling at a point to assure resilience. I would like to suggest that there is still a protective quality in diversity. People suggest that following standards brings common vulnerability, but diversity in organizational idiosyncrasies either protect a community or supply chain, or might make it vulnerable if we don't celebrate them and build on them. And understanding this, I believe, is a big part of the anti-fragility that can steer us towards safety. Understanding the models in a way that we can act on them to embed cybersecurity leads us to consider the component parts that we can then nudge, temper, or steer to continuously protect, operate, and self-preserve. New Scientist, just in October of this year, carried an article simulating the world about using so-called artificial intelligence to model, well, life, the universe, and everything. It's an idea that I learned of in Asimov's Psychohistory in his Foundation series, when I made a study of his work at school. Oh, the other thing I learned of at school was one ought to be careful when creating a theory of evolution and robotics in a religious high school. In Asimov's Foundation saga, Harry Seldon realized that if you try to model the whole galactic empire, then you've got the complexity of the empire to manage rather than a model of it. Start with something manageable that represents the whole. I think we've got the diversity of Manchester's population to bring us that laboratory. We've just got to get it through the ethics committee. But if we're going to understand the dials and levers of safe behaviors, we need to understand that balance of people and technology. And these might be some of the components. And we can map them and adjust our systems to recognize people as part of the system rather than fight against them with these guilt throws of weakest link or strongest asset that I mentioned before. We can steer the social and mechanical and causal feedback needed to keep ourselves in a situation of cyber safety. It's a pattern or an idea that actually takes me back to my first job working for ANTI on urban traffic control and a system which we called Scoot, which was all about making sure that we control the traffic lights to keep the traffic flowing in the right directions and could take account of the fact that, okay, you might have most of the traffic coming into town in the morning, a lot of it going out in the evening, but if City are playing at home on a Wednesday afternoon, that rather buggers up that model. Oops, pardon my French. After all, The term cyber comes from Viner's cybernetics. It's about steering. Other claims of where it came from, by the way, which might be grounded in science fiction, are available and wrong. So, meanwhile, back at the letterbox, one of the items I picked up from the mail collect service was a letter from BT sending me my customer number. I hadn't asked for it. I called BT. I was on record for having requested it. No, I hadn't. Yes, you did. It says here on my screen, said the operator. I'd better add that the value of the customer number is part of the data that they require to add mobile phones to landline billing. Most of the rest of it is, all you need to know is somebody's name and address. The letters started turning up in my postbox again, or my letterbox, should I say. The mail collector service failed with the frequently used deployment of relief posties. And one of the letters was my customer number, again, from BT. I call BT. I had another "it wasn't me" conversation, failing to explain the problem to the BT operator. He assumed in faulting English that if the topic of conversation was customer number, he ought to be posting my customer number to me again. I might have shouted at that stage. The revelation for taking care of information security probably came in 2008 when 2 disks with the entire HMRC database of child benefit details went missing. Computer Weekly sought my opinion and suggested that I wouldn't want the clerk who'd done that on my team. Well, quite the opposite. This clerk would know what it felt like. There would be a better appreciation of the risk than someone who just clicked their way through a few online horror stories of security disasters. It's not about the body of knowledge, it's about how you traverse it. It's about how confident you feel in what you know and your network of expertise to call on. It's about connecting know-how, which includes the psychology of system design, through to knowing which radio button to click or joint to solder. It's about professionalism and ethics. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. If you're an expert, scatter knowledge, not stumbling blocks. And it's also about governance and management of getting things done so that compliance is a byproduct, not the overshadowing be-all and end-all. So teaching to me looks rather like this. It's about introducing scenarios that will give students the feeling of what it's like to be there. Cybersecurity is about collaborative decisions. It seems that most students hurtle along expecting to hand in some personal work here, sitting an exam there. But here we throw them together to face the challenges based on my experience in industry. They learn that not every problem has a neat solution, and they work out the compromises. They agree, as my friend Royd would say, who has the decision rights and what are the escalation paths when those aren't enough. And every year, there are those precious students who understand that there is more to cybersecurity than is dreamt of in our lecture theatres. They come to those extracurricular activities that give them the edge, learning to collaborate even further, building their own networks, spreading the love of learning, and doing good with it. Last year was particularly exciting with a team entering the Atlantic Council Cyber 912 competition, where they had to deal with a believable cyber threat to the UK and beyond, and imagine how they would have to advise industry and then upwards to government on how to deal with those problems. We ran our own exercise in Chester in July, where the teams of teachers, school children, police, cyber penetration testers, policymakers, the list goes on, gathered to deal with everything from deep fakes to envelopes of suspicious white powder turning up in the post. Health and safety, it was cornflour, by the way. We can't predict everything in cyber, but we can practice how to cope. And what you see in these photographs is not only how others learn, it's how I learn too, and how I stay motivated to keep learning. Cultures, countries, genders, neuro, diversity and adversity. When we harness this, the bad people won't stand a chance in that place that cats don't stand a chance in. And we're more than just a teeny bit proud of our route along the path to diversity. with a 30 to 50 male-female split in our flagship cyber modules here at the university. But again, like the school reports say, can do better, and God willing, we will. When I really began to spread my wings beyond computer science, I asked for a job title which would neither sounded silly and would fit on a business card. So they printed it very small. Academic coordinator for cybersecurity. But hey, the coordinator is good. Sounds like a character in Doctor Who. Risk is usually associated with bad things. But if we view collaboration as a gathering of expertise to increase the risk of success, we may feel better about working with diverse disciplines and ready to work together when the inevitable black swan emerges from the mist. The cybersecurity race is won when we embrace views of risk different to our own and embrace colleagues with specialist knowledge. Don't dismiss them as risk-averse naysayers. After all, Radio 4 doesn't make us an expert in everything. Which leaves my shopping list rather like what I've listed here on this slide. The photographs show the original and first outing of the reconvened Ratio Club. This was, and is again, an instrument to wade through complex matters and attempt some clear thinking on selected topics that cyber challenges us with. The Ratio Club is a place to share and challenge ideas without being ashamed or afraid. They're not bound by the usual deferences to chains of command or academic hierarchy, or we have changed the rules. In the original Ratio Club, if you were made professor, they chucked you out on the basis that everybody would have expected to give you deference. I think, thank God, we're a little bit more modern about that rank now, but still very fortunate. We did, of course, lament that none of the original members, like Alan Turing, were around to support us, but we have been able and fortunate to retain the support of his nephew, Sir Dermot. We've managed this twice, and we're planning a third outing in the new year. It's an engine for diversification. We are unconventional conventionalists who break down the walls between the disciplines, lest we just squat in silos of preconception and self-harm with Occam's razor. Meanwhile, it was wet outside, so I thought I'd let my fingers do the walking to make some outstanding arrangements and bill payments. I called the telephone banking and was locked out after the first security question because I'd failed security earlier that day. I hadn't called them earlier that day. Now, MI5 tells us, or told us at least, security is the reward for never ceasing vigilance. So let's look at what went wrong. It was not my overdraft that was so interesting. It was the fact that I had a good enough credit rating to be toyed with to acquire credit in my name. You don't need to be Riches or a keeper of state secrets to become a target. The problem was not what I did with my data, but the loose way that others had actually publicized my data with their objective of transparency. For example, Companies House published enough information about me for criminals to do most of what they did in terms of opening a bank account and getting that credit card. Then came the film noir moment. When I tried to find out exactly what information had been used to successfully get credit in my name, the bank refused to tell me in the first instance, on the basis that it was the criminal which had opened the account. So data protection meant that they couldn't tell me because it was not my data, it was the criminal's. To be fair, the then incumbent of the Information Commissioner's Office, Christopher Graham, did think that this was a jolly good wheeze on the bank's part. So what did I do about this? Well, other than, of course, go on a password management blitz. I made adjustments to my digital footprint, such as removing the office phone number from an online register. I took out a credit check monitoring and alert service subscription, so anyone trying to take out a new credit card or the like would cause an email to be sent to me. I continued using the mail collect service with caution. And I shared the story with the new Cyber Resilience Centre for Greater Manchester so that the local police could see how incidents like this develop from a personal perspective. Oh, I must add that the police did agree to get involved a bit when a neighbour saw a stranger with his fingers in my letterbox. and it wasn't a relief postie. So into the future. Robert recently asked me, what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, I have my sights on a tool, or perhaps it's just some sort of novel publication. I'm calling it an Anthropotechnicon, a route map through cybersecurity knowledge, behavior, and technology, and the ability to focus and use it to keep people safe online and by connection to the physical world. It'll be a route map showing how to steer and focus that expertise when it's needed. I'd like to promulgate this Anthropotechnicon in a more scenario-based teaching, creating the empathy needed to understand our places and to help each other, and understand who will just be on the receiving end of our help. At this far end of the incident scale, I'd like to derive a sort of cyber CPR to help people cope in the immediate aftermath of an incident. Remember that with all my network, when the criminals attacked me, I felt alone in that first instance. More recently, I've been privileged to join Professor Emma Barrett and a cast of thousands to put a detail on an upcoming publication from Policy at Manchester, and with Nick Ponsillo to arrange our second outing of the incident with the white powder, etc., that I talked about in Chester. We're planning this second experiential day of cyber-related mayhem so that people can emerge knowing what it's like to be attacked, but in a safe environment. Second and final graph, I believe, if I remember. It's the professor thing. You suddenly go all absent-minded, apparently. This is where we are. It's a time that I call a period of inevitable risk. But this is also a Toynbee convector, named by Ray Bradbury for the historian Arnold J. Toynbee, who observed that civilization must respond to a challenge in order to flourish. And that challenge is cybersecurity. We certainly have it. It's up to us to hack the doomsday clock so the hands will run backwards from midnight. And I'm privileged to be part of a professional community that I believe is going to make it so. If we're going to have a new cybersecurity paradigm, we will need to keep looking, but I'm happy to report that I'm not looking alone. So I want to thank you for all the faith that you've shown in getting me here today. If you want to have fun on more than just a security clearance form, find yourself a partner who was born in Rhodesia to a Welsh mother and a Dutch father and brought up on Merseyside after escaping through Mozambique and France to Horwich. And a thank you to my wonderfully supportive wife, Rowena, now firmly documented as a British citizen. Oh, and the irony of the building in the background where the citizenship ceremony was held is not actually lost on me. I'll leave that one to you for you to ponder. You've got to put me into context. What sort of person am I? Well, judge me on this. When a visiting foreign delegation gave me a gift, a very lovely Peking opera doll, it seemed like caution should be the watchword. A colleague suggested binning it. But we're academics! We should be a bit more inquisitive. So I took it to the Proton Science Institute for an X-ray scan. And the result? It was clean. Financial criminals might have thought I have something for them, but the nation states aren't interested. So, we're here. Thank you for the privilege of delivering this lecture and the trust that you assigned to me to keep up working for diversity and adversity. In a classic book of Jewish ethics, Rabbi Masya ben Choresh teaches us that it is better to be a tail to lions than a head to foxes, and that's why I hang out with you lions. My late father introduced me to the lesser known of Sellers and Yateman's books, perhaps poignantly titled, "And Now All This." Thank you.
usual fashion, given that I'm not very good at choosing people, I'll let Danny do some choosing, Danny. As if anyone's got any questions.
So, first of all, Danny, congratulations on behalf of all of us.
Thank you.
are truly the professor we don't deserve. What's the biggest lesson you learned from sci-fi?
Sorry, the phone?
What's the biggest lesson you've learned from sci-fi in your career?
That it is a very good way of sifting out who's worthwhile talking to you, or at least is going to listen to you, on the basis that I find, as you've noticed, I find it very difficult to not come up with something which doesn't have a sci-fi analogy. The second level, that's the first level of test. The second level of test is, if is this a person I'm going to like and get on with, is, do they like the original series of Doctor Who? Now, Jenny, you've been very open to me, and you say you don't like either of them, so I've no idea why we get on at all. I'm very glad we do. Alan.
I'd like to echo Jenny's words. I'm very privileged to work with you on a once-a-year basis, so thank you for sticking with it. Similar to Jenny's question, actually, given the makeup of your student body is so diverse and much younger than those of us of our sort of generation, how do you explain Blake's up?
Well, the first thing I do is I make sure that they're not watching the illegally uploaded version on YouTube. I also tell them that only the first 3 seasons are worth watching, although you might want to give the last episode of the 4th season a bit of a... Sorry, am I going off on one?
And if I can follow up, so how do you explain Severin as a role model in that case?
I think that was one of the best decisions that the BBC ever made. They were going for the usual cliche of, a gang of goodies against a gang of baddies dressed in black. And the leader of the wicked space security command was going to be a bloke, as usual, dressed in black. They made it a woman, and she chose to be dressed in white. So if that's not breaking down gender stereotypes and everything else, I don't know what is. No, you can always tell the keen front rows. I don't know how many questions are allowed, so should we say Tim and Will, and then people will probably want to get out and get to the food.
Danny, how, in this week, millions of people are going to vote on Strictly and sports personality, and celebrity, and something tomorrow. They'll be happy to use their phones and their laptops to vote on all these things. They'll be happy to spend money to vote on these things, and then tomorrow we'll be focused on pencil and paper. How do we get people to actually trust that we can move forward on pencil and paper and catch up with Strictly when it comes to the big events like national elections?
Well, okay, don't quote me on this, but just thinking off the top of my head, maybe we each have to pay 25p to vote. And it'll go to good causes. And maybe that's how we make up the budget deficit. There we go, an idea thought in Manchester tonight. But no, but you make a very good point, and you also describe the times when we are most vulnerable, when people will be thinking about these things and be focused on these things. And whereas previously people wouldn't click on a link, there was an example today where just one letter changed in a Twitter handle was diverting people and misinforming them. And people didn't stop to think, is that real or isn't it? We're still some time off, I believe, getting to the stage, but one of Jenny's podcast guests, I can't remember who it was now, made the best point, I think, ever, is that a little bit like this goal that I have that, we should have these kind of general core objectives. The core objectives for the IT department, who are not the kind of people who ought to be handling your cyber security, they will help you with it, certainly. The core objective for them is that any organisation, it should be safe to click on that link that gets through all those filters and everything else which have been set up. It shouldn't cause the mayhem and the damage that does. So we get that kind of symbiosis. But times change, and hopefully these technologies will change for the better. Yeah, Will.
Danny, congratulations on a great lecture. I've really enjoyed it. You've been giving me earache for a long time now about Doctor Who and the latest episode.
You had dark hair before I started.
Who was your favourite doctor?
John Pertwee, no question about it. But I don't wear velvet jackets because I can't stand the crushed velvet. Okay, one final one. And one of the reasons why I'm picking out these people who are not only asking questions is these are the people who come in and talk and share and spend time with the students year in, year out, for years have been part of the course. And that's why I feel that this professorship is very much a gestalt, because I haven't spent years in banking, I haven't spent years in engineering, but I have colleagues who have. And they are able to come and put that together. So I am just the guy wearing the top hat and the red coat. I won't mention the whip. Sorry, I was going to let Royd ask well, hopefully, an easy question.
Oh, yeah. Well, so it won't be about that. It's an opportunity to ask you something which has nothing to do with the work that we've shared. So congratulations on your professorship.
Thank you.
And it's great. Am I right in thinking that ORAC was a quantum computer? And if so, what impact does those technologies have on the world of cyber security in the future? Will it have much of an impact, given that cyber security is, to such a great degree, a human problem and not a technology?
Oh, I shouldn't have allowed that. We're going to be here all night now. Okay. Firstly, I don't know about where the quantum computing reference came from, but certainly the idea of ORAC was that there was common technology in every computer, therefore ORAC was able to drain information and take information out of it. But it's an excellent example of the challenge we had. I don't know whether you remember, I think it was last year, I always forget the name of the publication, suggested that many large organizations' servers had hidden on it a little chip which a foreign power had managed to get into the supply chain. It almost seems, as far as I know, that this was a hoax. They are still claiming it's true. No one has seen any evidence for this. I think it's quite easy to have found some physical evidence if people were looking for it. It wasn't the fact that it would seem that this story wasn't true, it's more that this story is plausible. So what we need to know is how to have our data, our personification in electronic form on these systems in a safe way, that people, so we can retain the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability. So to protect, operate, and self-preserve is somehow protected, because this is the problem that we have now. Things are safe. People shouldn't need to know. I'm not a car mechanic. I know the basics. Like Cyber Essentials, I know the basics of what I should do to keep my car safely on the road, and I take it for a test every year because I've got an old car. Oh, I'm a professor, can I have a wage rise? No, but so quick decision making. But so I think again it's this collaboration and creating safe environments. Whether it's encryption, is the solution. But of course, sooner or later, you've got to get the stuff in a way that you can read it and use it on a device. The only thing I know is the answer has got to include something other than passwords. Hey, this is the first time I mentioned passwords. Yes. Not bad going. Thank you.
So, thank you, Danny. So, just before we round off, usual thanks, especially to AXO and everyone else who made this event possible and organised it. There are some groups of light refreshments, I believe the phrase is, outside in the bike cafe area, so we can hang around and chat for a bit. And finally, let's do a big hurrah for Danny. You may now go.